Is water now a weapon? Was it always? Can the Indus Water Treaty be reimagined for cooperation in what seems like a fractured future?
In a water system, a water management system, which is already overstretched, which is true of Pakistan's water management, any interruption to flow or timing could have outsized impacts.
Welcome to another episode of Justify. The Indus Water Treaty has long been seen as a successful example of water diplomacy. It survived multiple wars between India and Pakistan. But today, this once hailed symbol of cooperation faces unprecedented strain. Climate change is transforming the very geographical context that underpins the treaty's logic. Population growth and development pressures are intensifying demand for water. And perhaps that is why India kept the treaty in abeyance following the Pahalgam attack and the end of the operations of phase one of Operation Sindhu. As a result of India's action, new questions have now arisen. Is water now a weapon? Was it always? Can the Indus Water Treaty be reimagined for cooperation in what seems like a fractured future? Joining us today is Dr. Daniel Haines, the author of Rivers Divided, Indus Basin Waters in the Making of India and Pakistan. The book is a masterful account spanning British irrigation legacies and contemporary water diplomacy. Dr. Haines is currently an associate professor in the history of risk and disaster reduction at the University College London. Dan, welcome to Justify. So you wrote in an article recently that India's decision to keep the Indus Water Treaties in abeyance is, and I quote, a highly significant step, and that its, I quote again, impact will vary depending on how long it lasts, unquote. Explain to us the impact of India's decision to keep the Indus Water Treaties in abeyance and why it's being termed unprecedented.
We can classify the impacts as hydrological, impacts on water availability in Pakistan, and also think a little bit about the political implications of India's putting the treaty into abeyance, which is completely unprecedented in the long history of India-Pakistan water sharing since the treaty was signed in 1960. The impacts on water availability in Pakistan really vary between the short-term and the long-term picture. In the short term, there is an amount of action that Indian engineers can take with upstream projects to reduce water flows in Pakistani rivers. So we've seen that flushing sediment out of reservoirs on existing hydropower projects can temporarily halt the water flow to Pakistan while those reservoirs get refilled. Under the Indus Waters Treaty, this was restricted to particular times of the year, particularly over the main summer inundation period where there's frankly more than enough water in the Indus River system to go round. Where that can pose more of a challenge for water management in Pakistan is if that happens in winter during the Rabi crop sowing season, where there's much less water available in the system.
So you're saying, if I understand this right, that if now, because the treaty is in abeyance, India can change the timing when it flushes the sediment in a way that could potentially lead to some further scarcity of water in winter in Pakistan. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. So India at the moment has fairly limited capacity to actually hold back enough water to disrupt flows for a long period of time. But the physical geographer Hassan Khan, who's a scholar in the United States, has made the correct point that in a water system, a water management system, which is already overstretched, which is true of Pakistan's water management, any interruption to flow or timing could have outsized impacts because the amount of water that is required in Pakistan to sustain the agricultural system and hydropower projects is already really high.
Right. So when you talk about the impact, you said both impact on agriculture as well as on its dams. Is that correct? And if so, then what exactly is the kind of impact, the scale of impact that we are talking about? Are we talking about the dams not operating at full capacity? Similarly with farming, as in what is it that we actually mean in a real world context?
Probably the impact on hydropower dams would be more limited because those typically have large storage reservoirs in which Pakistani engineers can build up a load of water. So if you go to any storage dam and you look at the structure, there's normally a huge buildup of water behind it. India has similar storage dams, not on the western rivers for reasons we might come to, but certainly the Bakra Nangal project in Himachal Pradesh has a huge reservoir behind it. And you'll see the same thing if you go to Mangla or Tarabela or the other big Pakistani hydropower dams. So that gives Pakistani engineers the opportunity to capture water when it's coming downstream and hold it back for when they need it. That's pretty much the entire point of a storage reservoir. For agriculture, this can be more of a problem. So those same storage reservoirs, to an extent, can regulate water flow that comes downstream in Pakistan. But on the River Chenab, for example, Pakistan has no storage works, and India contributes the entire flow of the Chenab. So basically, all the water that's in the Chenab in Pakistan, it crosses the border near Sialkot in Punjab, comes from Indian territory. So there's a limited amount that Pakistani engineers can do to regulate the water flow on the Chenab if India's withholding some water there. At the moment, India has the Baglihar and Ratle projects on the Chenab and could construct more in future.
Right. And so this may sound like a pretty basic question, but the Indus Water Treaty governs not just the Indus, but the five rivers in the Punjab, or what is the territorial scope of the treaty?
That's right. It covers all of the what we call surface water in the Indus Basin. So that is to say, water that runs through rivers. We distinguish between surface water and groundwater, which is what comes up from the ground, as the name implies.
Yeah, yeah. So I think so that actually takes me to your book, because your book takes us to the origins of the Indus Water Treaty. And as I hinted in the first part of the question, that and you said that this is unprecedented because India has never done this. India has threatened on many occasions, and we fought many wars with Pakistan, that we will do something in relation to the Indus Water Treaty, but never gone and actually done it, despite the posturing. So just take us back to the negotiation of the treaty. The World Bank has played a critical role for a number of years before this treaty actually was signed. So what were the political and territorial stakes at play for two newly independent nations in the 1950s to negotiate what is a landmark water treaty?
So if you think about India and Pakistan at the moment of independence in 1947, they've both emerged out of centuries of British rule, or misrule, as we might also call it. They've been through the bloody trauma of partition, and they're both countries where there's a long history of poverty, which also partly comes down to colonial economics, but that's probably a topic for a separate podcast. And they both have a pressing need to do what we would now call economic development. At the time, they normally called it nation building. Now we'd probably call it development. And based on established colonial precedents, one of the main ways to do economic development in the rural economies in India and Pakistan was to dig canals and build dams. This is something that the British had been doing in what is now Punjab and Sindh, on both sides of the border in Punjab since the 1880s. And those projects had generally yielded pretty good financial returns. So both the Indian and Pakistani governments had an established economy in these regions which depended on canal irrigation, and they wanted to build more. Unfortunately, the Radcliffe Line, which was the new border between India and Pakistan in Punjab, cut straight through the irrigation system of what had previously been a united province. That seemed fine. Nobody really thought about this much, as far as we know from the historical documents available from the Boundary Commission. But it became a problem very suddenly in April 1948, because an agreement that the two governments of Punjab had struck at the moment of partition expired. And that agreement had said that Indian engineers would continue to allow water to flow through all of the canals that went from Indian territory into Pakistani territory. So India reduced the water flow into some economically really important Pakistani canals at that point. And as you can imagine, the reaction in Pakistan was intense. Newspapers were full of reports that India was trying to starve West Punjabi farmers to death. There was a big moment of what you might call nationalist rhetoric, saying that water was essential to Pakistan's survival. And that really is set the foundations for the political discourse that we continue to see today. Although it's undergone various phases due to the treaty coming in. So for both governments, water was economically really important and it was emotionally important as well. So the way that citizens in India and Pakistan could imagine themselves as citizens of the new states was partly bound up with the idea that development was going to improve, poverty was going to decline, and that giant new dams and irrigation canals were going to be part of the, if you like, the package of modernity that India and Pakistan could develop now that they were free from colonialism.
And was that, if I may stop you for a moment there, and was that initial decision uh, after the agreement between the two governments of Punjab ended in April 1948, the decision to reduce water flow into Pakistan and Punjab in Pakistan, did that have anything to do with the fact that we were fighting a war in Kashmir at that point of time? So was water always a weapon to be used at wartime?
There's no evidence that I could find in several years of researching this book. And I did field work in India, Pakistan, and archives in the US and the UK, looking and trying to look at this history of the Indus dispute from all angles that I could. I didn't find any evidence that there's any direct connection between conflict in Kashmir or more broadly conflict between India and Pakistan and water sharing. In fact, when I began researching the book back in the early 2010s, there was quite a lot of think tank commentary out there arguing that the Kashmir problem and the Indus Waters problem were really one and the same. But I, in no case, could find any hard evidence that the decision making in Kashmir had directly affected decision making with water sharing.
Right. So that actually perhaps demonstrates that maybe this is a change of stance actually in some way, that water has become an instrument to be used at a time of hostility. But let's go back to the 50s. So now this agreement is no longer, that agreement too is no longer in operation. So how do India and Pakistan start talking again?
So the key moment was an intervention by an American called David Lilienthal, who was the former chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's a body in the US which brought together several states in the US federal system who had really quite bitter water sharing relations. As we'll know from the Indian context, subnational water politics can be pretty much as intense as international. The same was very much true of the US in the early 20th century. And the TVA had done a lot to organize and sort out water sharing in the southeastern US. And Lilienthal thought that you could do the same thing in South Asia, particularly in Punjab, because he thought that the engineers who staffed the public works departments on both sides of the border had a kind of technical expertise and an identity as apolitical engineers that you just needed to kind of reignite, that they could remember their professional background. And also the fact that these individuals had grown up under the same colonial irrigation service. They'd trained together, they'd worked together until just a few years earlier. So Lilienthal thought, if we can get the engineers into the room, get the politicians out of the room, you will very quickly find that the engineers begin devising the technically most perfect system that you could get to maximize the efficiency the efficiency of water use across the Indus Basin, as if the international border didn't exist.
But how did Lilienthal get into the room?
Lilienthal was brought in. Ostensibly, he went to visited India and Pakistan as a correspondent for a magazine called Colliers. And in fact, he published a series of articles about India and Pakistan after his visit. But he actually went with the blessings of the American State Department, who were developing their interests in influencing, shall we say, politics around the world, including in Asia, in the context of the Cold War. and he also developed contacts at the high levels with the Indian and Pakistani governments. So although his trip to South Asia was billed as a journalistic exercise, it actually was in some ways a sort of backdoor cooperation between the three governments.
Right. So, no, sorry. So you were saying, so he thought that this a technocratic solution could be found. I mean, the Radcliffe line be damned,
That's
and
right.
and is it successful? I mean, and clearly it is. I mean, we end up signing the treaty. But what does it take to get political will on both sides to do this?
So in a lot of ways, although Lilienthal kickstarted the negotiations that resulted in the Indus Waters Treaty, he was almost 100% wrong in all of his starting premise, because his grand idea, firstly, was that engineers would negotiate apolitically, as we've said, and that turned out to be completely mistaken, because throughout the 1950s, the Indian delegation nearly always put forward plans that just benefited India, and the Pakistani delegation nearly always put forward plans that just benefited Pakistan. He was also wrong in that he thought his logic for arguing that not only could India and Pakistan solve the Indus Waters dispute, but the US should get involved in trying to help them do it. His logic was that this would be a step along the way to resolving the Kashmir conflict, and
Oh.
that once Kashmir was settled, India and Pakistan could both forget their regional rivalries and join the American-led bloc in the Cold War to prevent the spread of communism in Asia. As we know, the Kashmir conflict absolutely did not go away in 1960 when the Indus Treaty was signed. The one thing he was right about was that the World Bank could facilitate negotiations. In fact, the World Bank wound up playing a much more active role in developing plans for water management than it had originally wanted to. So actually, the principle that we eventually got in the Indus Waters Treaty, that you would divide the rivers territorially so that Pakistan would effectively get most of the use of what we call the western rivers, that is the Indus main stem, the Jhelum and the Chenab, and India would have full control of the eastern rivers, that is the Sutlej, the Ravi, and the Beas. That was a World Bank proposal originally in 1954, because the bank was getting increasingly frustrated that the Indian and Pakistani engineers just couldn't seem to find any common ground. And it took another 6 years from 1954 to actually sort out the details and get both of the governments to sign the treaty in 1960.
Well, that's great actually that it wasn't the engineers, because engineers don't sign treaties. Ultimately, politicians do. And I'm glad that Lilienthal was wrong on that, and the politicians ultimately did sign the treaty. And Nehru at that point of time had called it I quote, a happy symbol of cooperation, whereas others have called it perhaps a little bit more skeptically as a water division arrangement. Of course, the nicest way to put it is a water sharing arrangement. But there are several kinds of terms depending on actually where you're coming from. So, how do you see this treaty? As in, do you think that on the whole this was a fair water sharing arrangement, or do you think that it had the remnants of the engineers looking out for national self-interest?
I think whether the treaty was fair or not is a really controversial topic in both India and Pakistan. And what I've found is that the majority of Indians I speak to think that the treaty was unfair because it allocated 70 to 80% of the water in the Indus system to Pakistan, and more recently because of the way that the dispute resolution mechanism involved third parties. Pakistanis I speak to overwhelmingly believe that the treaty was unfair because Pakistan had to sign away its rights to the eastern rivers, on which Pakistan actually had lots of established irrigation projects. So one thing that Pakistan had to do after the treaty was signed was build these huge link canals, 8 of them, to transfer water from the western rivers to its old canal colonies, which mainly came off the Sutlej, but otherwise down to where the areas where the eastern rivers had used to flow. My view is that firstly, fairness is partly a question of values. What are we valuing when we say a treaty is fair or unfair? But as a rule of thumb, if both sides are unhappy with a compromise, it's probably a pretty decent compromise. So on that basis, I would say that the treaty was reasonably fair. We can certainly say that both Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, and Ayub Khan, who by that point was the President of Pakistan, following a military coup in 1958. Both of them had pretty good reasons to sign it. So I think it's very understandable they both signed it in 1960.
Yeah, to me, a treaty that both sides are criticizing sounds like someone got it right. So I think that, at least for, if not for anything else, it was something that stood the test of time. India, however, has called for amending the treaty many times. There's maybe Pakistan has as well, and I'm not aware, but certainly I'm aware of the fact that India has done that. It said for several significant reasons. It said that. It doesn't cover several related issues. There's technological developments that have taken place. And there are a number of occasions, at least in the last few years, that the Indian government has written to the Pakistani government in terms of how we can evolve the treaty. And so I wanted to ask you that how does keeping this issue of the treaty being in abeyance on one side, um, do you think the Indus Waters Treaty has stood the test of time? Or do you think it needs to evolve in any particular way?
Yes and no. So partly circling back to your previous question about cooperation, I view the treaty as a pretty successful mechanism for reducing the amount of cooperation and trust that you needed between India and Pakistan to the absolute bare minimum. So by dividing the rivers, which by the way, as far as I know, is pretty much unique in international water sharing agreements. If you look at India's other water treaties, for example, the Ganga Treaty with Bangladesh, that's based on sharing, assigning volumes of flow to India and Bangladesh at certain times of year. There's nothing equivalent to the geography of the Indus Basin where you could separate out the western rivers and the eastern rivers in the same way. From Pakistan's point of view, the great value of the treaty was that it limited the need to trust India. And that might sound confronting to, I know I'm speaking to a largely Indian audience, but if you think about this from Pakistan's point of view, in 1948, East Punjab abruptly shut off the water supply to Pakistani canals for no other reason than that they could, basically. There's actually a whole subplot to do with East Punjab's relationships with other states in the Indian Union, but that also might be a subject for another podcast. And from there, the way that the negotiations developed was that increasingly the Pakistani negotiating team in the 1950s wanted to avoid any solution that made them depend on India's goodwill to let water continue to flow. India, for their part, didn't want to pay what they thought was an exorbitant cost of the replacement works that Pakistan was proposing. That's where eventually American and World Bank-led financing came into the final settlement in 1960. But the Indus Treaty did require some ongoing levels of minor cooperation because India had retained the right to develop hydropower projects and some small limited uses on the Western rivers. And actually, the problems that we've seen since really since the 2000s, but since the 90s, effectively, have really been to do with how you interpret those provisions that let India do some work on the Western rivers. And each difference or dispute is highly technical, so I'm not going to go into the details. But generally speaking, Pakistan wants to ensure that India complies with design restrictions to make sure that India can't develop the capacity to hold back water. In other words, that it can't do exactly what we were talking about earlier in terms of reducing or interrupting water flows through the Western rivers. And India generally has wanted to make sure that its projects on the Western rivers are economical, that they can be viable over the long term. Bear in mind the Indus system is extremely silty, so you get a huge amount of sediment building up behind these storage dams. Indian engineers rightly say we need to flush the sediment out, but the way that they want to do that, according to Pakistani arguments, actually infringes on the design parameters that the treaty allows. So the neutral expert decision over Buglihar in 2005, the Kishanganga Court of Arbitration Award in 2013, and the more recent differences and disagreements over Kishanganga, and then the Ratley projects have all come down to sediment management effectively and
Right.
how India can manage sediment. So when the Indian government says we need to update the treaty in light of technology change and climate change, that's one of the things they're probably talking about.
Right. That's fascinating that that all of this is basically down to some sediment. But I think a question that arose is that is it the point that as a consequence of the treaty, the rivers were divided, broadly speaking, as your book suggests, between the eastern rivers and the western rivers. But India continued to be able to build, subject to some restrictions, its projects, its hydropower projects on the Indus and the other western rivers. But as far as the Ravi, Bias, and Sutlej is concerned, Pakistan had no rights whatsoever.
That's right, broadly speaking.
Broadly speaking. Okay. So in that sense, then do you consider that this decision that India has taken to keep the treaty in abeyance after Pahalgam and Operation Sindoor, did that come as a surprise to you?
It did surprise me, but in retrospect, maybe it shouldn't have done.
Mm.
The senior Indian leaders have been making assertions about water sharing ever since 2016, since the Uri terror attack. And these were often reported, particularly by the media in India and Pakistan, to the extent that anybody in the UK noticed, also by media here. These have generally been reported as India threatens to cut off water to Pakistan in response to terrorist attacks. But if you look at the substance of the statements that people, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi, made in the 2010s, what they were talking about was generally fully utilizing India's water rights on the eastern rivers, not about or fully utilizing the rights it had on the western rivers as well, where, as we've said, India does have or did have the right to develop certain works under the Indus Waters Treaty, and it had not taken full advantage of those on either set of rivers. The difference now is that the Indus Waters Treaty itself has become subject to other kinds of condition. So effectively, what the Ministry of External Affairs announced when it put the treaty, well, when the government put the treaty into abeyance in late April, was that the treaty would remain in abeyance until Pakistan had, I forget the exact wording, but effectively fully renounced any support for cross-border terrorism, which of course the government of India has accused Pakistan of doing. That was a new phenomenon because up to that point, there had been no direct and explicit link between the treaty itself and India's security concerns. That's not to say that there was no consideration of security in the way people discussed the Indus Waters Treaty. Actually, one of the main sources of criticism in Pakistan of the Indus Waters Treaty has always been that the western rivers flow through Kashmir, and that meant that India's control over Jammu and Kashmir meant that that territorial control was potentially a threat to Pakistani water security. So that rhetoric was around in the 1940s, the 1950s, carried on through the 1960s, and right up till the present day. So that's really been a consistent part of Pakistani political discourse. I think the new thing we've seen now is on the Indian side, also the government of India directly linking water sharing and security concerns, although obviously the security concerns India has are different from the ones that Pakistan articulates.
So, do you think this is a new normal? Perhaps one of the reasons that India had not done this before is that though India is an upper riparian state when it comes to Pakistan, it's acutely cognizant of the fact that when it comes to the Brahmaputra, it is a downstream state, and there could be repercussions as far as the Northeast is concerned, and insofar as actions that China might take. So, do you think that this linking of water sharing and security is the new normal in South Asian diplomacy at this point of time?
So firstly, I think yes, probably this is the new normal in the sense that having made the link between security and the water treaty, I think it's unlikely that the government of India would let go of what it probably sees as a negotiating advantage. On the broader question about regional water politics, I'm not so sure there's a direct link. And I say this because India's relationships with other regional countries are pretty specific. So water sharing treaties tend to be specific to rivers, and they depend heavily on the geography of those rivers. We've already talked about the specific geography of the Indus Basin. On the Ganga, there's no opportunity to kind of separate out one river from another. So India and Bangladesh have the 1996 treaty that is phrased the way it is because that's the geography of the river.
Mm.
Um, the fact that India is downstream from China on the Brahmaputra is something that I've seen quite a lot of commentary on. I don't personally see any particular link between what's happening on the Indus with the Brahmaputra, because although Pakistan and China have a close relationship, and that's been much discussed in terms of military cooperation for obvious reasons in the last few weeks, I'm not aware of any particular restraint that the Chinese government has felt on developing the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra, the Tsangpo, on the basis of the existence of the Indus Waters Treaty. Now, I'm not a China expert. I might be misinformed. There could well be some agreement in place, or a gentleman's understanding in place. But we do know that even before the treaty went into abeyance, China announced plans to develop a huge dam on the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra.
Right. So
So
there is no restriction, and it doesn't have anything to do with what happens in the Indus. That's
yeah,
basically,
exactly.
yeah.
And similarly, I think Nepal and Bhutan have their own relationships with India. I don't think that has much to do with Pakistan.
Yeah, and Bangladesh, of course, as you said, as in there's no question of dividing the rivers. But having grown up in Calcutta, I know that there's always been a kind of sore issue about the barrage that India has made in the Chicken Neck in Farakka, which of course divides up the in that sense, as in the water goes in two channels, the main Ganga stem going into the river Padma in Bangladesh, and a smaller Hooghly coming into Bengal, and there's always been a little bit of rhetoric around it, but I don't think, as you rightly said, that this has any impact per se. So,
Okay,
given
sorry, can I just interrupt there?
yeah,
Since we're talking about sediment, a fun fact is that the Farakka issue was also mainly about sediment, because the reason why India wanted to develop the Farakka barrage and increase water flow through the Hooghly was to flush silt out of Calcutta port to make sure that the port remained useful and operational for big ships.
that's a fun fact. I think this is a fun sediment conversation that we've had. I did realize that the conversation would take this turn, but like the river, I think it takes many. So one final question to you, as in you've of course studied the history of Indus water sharing longer than many have. So India has now, of course, announced that the treaty is in abeyance, which is some kind of negotiating tactic. It doesn't seem, of course, that Pakistan is likely to make a declaration of the kind that India wants. It will soon be winter when the time of the Rabi crop will come around. Do you see that this will get the countries talking to each other quicker, maybe over the course of the next few months, and perhaps the treaty no longer being in abeyance going ahead? Or how do you see this playing out?
Well, for years ago, I was arguing that India and Pakistan should not renegotiate the Indus Waters Treaty. But like Mahatma Gandhi, I reserve the right to change my mind. The fact that the treaty has gone into abeyance, I think, means that there's not really a realistic.
Now you're really going with the flow.
I it's hard not
I
to make
should hope that.
when you're talking about rivers. I now research earthquakes, and actually, although there are lots of good earthquake puns available, they're more difficult to get into everyday conversation.
That's true. That's true. Anyway, sorry, you were saying. Yeah.
So I think we can hope that there will be some sort of renegotiation. I don't think it's going to be an easy path because negotiating the Indus Waters Treaty in the first place took 8 years of sustained effort and a huge amount of international development finance. And I don't think we have the luxury of time now. And I also don't think international politics and the financial situation being what it is, I don't think there's going to be a huge cash injection into either country to smooth over the compromise again.
Mm.
That said, there was so much that the original treaty left out that really should have been considered. So demographic changes and climate change is obviously a hugely important challenge for both countries. It's not strictly relevant to the original Indus Waters Treaty because the principle was the division of the rivers. So actually, to an extent, it doesn't matter how much water is in either river or how many people depend on it. But it would be sane and sensible for both countries to think seriously about these issues now. The other thing that's really missing from the treaty, or was missing from the treaty, I'm not quite sure whether we should be talking about it in the present tense or the past tense, frankly, but it said very little on water quality or ecosystem health. And both of these are really important. I mean, if you look at the downstream impact of waterlogging and drainage issues, both in Indian Punjab and across Pakistan, particularly Pakistani Punjab, a huge proportion of land actually in Pakistan by 1962-ish, the Pakistani government had already pivoted from worrying about water availability and the relationship with India to worrying about waterlogging in Punjab and Sindh, and launched a huge mission to try and improve drainage because they frankly had too much water going onto land. We still have that problem today, not helped by the fact that a huge amount of groundwater has been exploited on both sides of Punjab ever since the Green Revolution in the 1960s, 70s. So thinking much more seriously about ecosystem health, water quality, pollutants, all of these kinds of things should ideally be in any new kind of settlement. But I think in my most optimistic phase, what I hope might happen is that political leaders, economists, engineers, agricultural experts, everybody, frankly, in India and Pakistan might start thinking about alternatives to what is basically a colonial model for water exploitation. The way that the Indus Basin irrigation system was developed massively overused water. And that was pretty much by design because the British in the 1800s, the early 1900s thought they had pretty much unlimited water and unlimited land. And so what you should do is put as much water over as much land as possible. It already turned out by the 1920s and 1930s that they were wrong and that there wasn't enough water in the system even to serve the projects that the colonial governments in charge of Sindh and Punjab had cooked up. And since then, we've had just the most enormous amount of hydro development across the Indus Basin. And this uses too much water, and it uses water in inefficient ways. Agriculture is, I can't speak to the current figures for India, but the agricultural sector in Pakistan contributes well under half of GDP. It's a very large employer, so I think roughly 40% of the population in Pakistan is employed in agriculture. But for the amount of stress and tension and concern there is over water use, the economic benefit that Pakistanis get from water exploitation is really severely underdeveloped. So if there are moves, and here I'm getting out of my area of comfort because I'm not an agricultural economist, but drip irrigation, tunnel irrigation, all the innovative agricultural technologies we hear about in the science news, all of these things should become the new normal in the Indus Basin. And that could remove a lot of the tension, the political tension over water sharing, while also really improving livelihoods and ecosystem health.
I think we leave it there. I think there's a thought there which I think both the governments of India and Pakistan can agree on, is that perhaps we need to decolonize the Indus water basin to think about how this moment gives us both the opportunity to update our water management and water sharing systems, to promote some of these newer ideas of ecosystem health and water management and water quality that you were talking about, reducing the overexploitation of water that the Indus Water Treaty originally was based on. The situation, however, is a bit fluid at this point of time, and I hope that it works out well for both countries. And irrespective of whether this linkage between water and national security continues, we should certainly hope that this moment allows us to think about an Indus Water Treaty that is truly suitable for the 21st century. Thanks very much, Dan. It was a really illuminating conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did too. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing your views.